Welcome, everyone. I'm Alicia Holland, an associate professor in the government department, and I'm thrilled to be your moderator today to discuss the implementation of Colombia's peace accords. And I'm joined today by my co-moderators, Frances Hagopian, who's also a professor in the government department. Fran, do you want to say hi? As well as Steve Levitsky, who is the director of Dr. Class and teaches in the government department.
Hi, everybody.
Great. So we're really excited today as well that this is the first webinar that we've actually been able to translate. So we also have two translators on the call, Jorge and Andrea, who will be doing simultaneous translation. To access the translation, there is a globe at the bottom of your screen where you just want to click and select Spanish translation. And briefly, bienvenidos, y para acceder a la traducción en español hay un globo en la parte inferior de la pantalla y se das clic y se puede acceder a la traducción. Okay, so just a few other logistical housekeeping details before I introduce today's wonderful panelists. So we are recording today. The recording of the event will be available on the Dr. Class YouTube channel soon after the event. Also in the chat, you can find a link to Dr. Class's calendar, which has information on all of our upcoming events. And lastly, during today's presentation, you should feel free to ask questions using the Q&A function within Zoom. You can ask your questions in Spanish or English, and we'll collect them and ask the audience questions after the presentations. So let me introduce our wonderful speakers. So first up, we have Sandra Botero, who is an assistant professor of political science at the Universidad de Rosario in Bogota. She specializes in law and politics, judicial behavior, as well as electoral behavior in Latin America. And her most recent publication relies on a tremendous nationally representative survey to explore public support for Colombia's transitional justice process, which we'll hopefully hear a little bit about today. Second, we have Juana Garcia Luque, who is an associate professor at the business school at the Universidad de los Andes, also in Bogota. And she's also a visiting scholar this year at Dr. Class. And she's working on a project on the role of international cooperation and the private sector in peacekeeping. She also leads the participation of Universidad de los Andes with the Colombian Agency for the Reintegration of Ex-Combatants, which works with multiple societal stakeholders, including business organizations on reintegration issues. Then we're also very pleased to have with us Juanita Gobertus, who is a Colombian congresswoman and former member of the government's peace delegation with the FARC. She's an expert in peace, security, transitional justice, post-conflict, and she was elected to Congress in 2018 with the Alianza Verde party, and is one of the young voices on the peace process in the legislature. And we can also say welcome back to Juanita because she holds a master's in law from Harvard. And last, we have Mauricio Velázquez, who's a professor of government at Universidad de los Andes and holds a PhD in political science from UCLA. He works on issues of land titling, environmental sustainability, and rural inequality. Mauricio also has been researching the implementation of the rural development programs that are part of the peace accords. And hopefully we'll hear about that, and I'm sure other themes related to the rural challenges today. So without further ado, given we have four panelists, I'm going to turn it over to Sandra to kick it off, giving us a sense of the broader political landscape behind the accords.
Thank you so much, Alicia, and thank you, Stephen, Fran, and everyone at the David Rockefeller Center for the invitation, for opening up this space so we can talk about the achievements, the setbacks, and the prospects of the peace accords, which were signed 5 years ago in Havana. Since I go first, like Alicia mentioned, I'm going to offer a general overview, talk a little bit about public support for the peace accords here in Colombia, and discuss how electoral politics have complicated and will continue to complicate implementation. Those of you who follow news in Colombia will know, and if you do not follow news in Colombia, let me tell you that implementing the agreements has been rough. The agreement itself was an important political victory that demobilized the oldest active guerrilla in the hemisphere. One of the challenges in taking stock of the Colombian peace accords is the complexity of our conflict and the complexity of the accords themselves, right? Which were over 300 pages long. Many things were at stake. So one way that I find helpful is to cut the pie and break up the accords in terms of the big themes that the accords tried to tackle. On the one hand, the mobilization and reintegration of the FARC guerrilla. On the other hand, political participation of former combatants. On the other hand, transitional justice. Another component that is called Reforma Rural Integral, or roughly rural development, rural reform. And finally, some attention to the problem of narcotráfico, illicit drugs. When we discuss the different components of the accords, we have to keep in mind that victims were at the center of the accords, and there was a concerted effort to implement, or at least an interest in implementing, with an eye to gender and ethnic considerations. In the 5 years since the negotiations ended, we have seen some important advances in certain areas, perhaps especially in the mobilization, participation, at least for national elected offices, where we have senators who have seats in our national Congress who were former FARC combatants. We have seen and are witnessing the takeoff of the transitional justice institutional framework with the JEP at its helm. The JEP, when I use the term JEP, I refer to the Justicia Especial para la Paz, which is the name in Spanish of the Transitional Justice Tribunal. That is key to the different components of the transitional justice part of the accords. By the way, the JEP is about to hand down its first decision in the next couple of weeks. So we're in the middle of a very important process in that sense too. But at the same time, there is a real sense among many in Colombia that several important areas of the agreement have not been implemented at all, are delayed, or are being actively ignored, sabotaged by the current administration, or as a result of electoral politicking. So some of my fellow panelists will offer their expertise and help us delve into some of the details, I'm sure, so I won't repeat, but I will say two general things. So I think this is not a post-conflict scenario. This is post-conflict painfully mixed with conflict. We have seen the number of assassinations of civic and social leaders skyrocket in the last 2 years. 331 killed in 2020 alone. The figures differ, but this is one of the recent counts. We are seeing very high levels of violence in specific areas of Colombia, especially in places like Cauca, but not only Cauca. And this surge in violence is jarring for two reasons. It comes after a period of several years of calm during the second half of the negotiations in particular, when the truce actually worked, and we saw that. But also it smells and sounds like the previous cycles of violence we have been through in Colombia. And so you have people like Francisco Gutierrez Sanin asking if we are about to embark, unfortunately, on the third cycle of violence that this country has seen in the 20th and 21st century. So 5 years into implementation, one thing that I think is crucial to understanding some of the obstacles that we have faced so far and will continue facing is public support for the accords and the electoral dynamics, like I mentioned. So we have to talk about this because implementing a peace agreement requires the government's commitment to this agreement. And here, citizen perceptions can both push governments, but as we know, they can also be shaped by governmental elites. So this is a two-way process. Because the accords are so complex, like I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, right? They have so many moving parts, and they tried to tackle and were ambitious in tackling very different areas and realms of the Colombian conflict. They are not one single thing, but sometimes in public discussion, they are reduced to this one single dimension. And it often tends to be the transitional justice dimension. So the public's attitudes towards the different components, I'm going to frame those first in a discussion generally about the accords with a couple of nuggets of information. So the information I'm about to share comes from the surveys done by the Observatorio de la Democracia, who do some of the most serious academic work on public opinion in Colombia. And a lot of my thinking about how public opinion has evolved and how it shapes the implementation and the accords comes from a project that I'm working on with Miguel Garcia and our discussions about this. So the first thing, so bear with me because this two bits of historical information matter. So historically, support for negotiated peace in Colombia has been high. Around 70% of Colombians consistently support negotiated peace, and this is starting in 2004 when we begin to have data about this. When we look at support for the agreement more specifically, we also notice that it has been growing historically. So it started at 41% in 2016, right after the agreements were signed. And they have grown to around 55% in the most recent survey. So what this tells you immediately is one, there isn't overwhelming political consensus or support around peace in Colombia, though one could say that 55% and growing and support for negotiated peace are not so bad. But two, as soon as I tell you those figures, I also immediately have to tell you that the figure that looks at broad support is misleading and we need to unpack it. Because like I said earlier, the agreements are not a single issue thing and public opinion about the agreement is not monolithic. Peace agreements are very hard pills to swallow. Perpetrators of violence are afforded concessions that many see as profoundly unjust. It's very easy to politicize them, but they are crucial because implementation, especially of really ambitious accords like the ones that were signed in Havana, require some sort of, or are very much helped by some sort of consensus and support. So let's talk a little bit about how it breaks up among the different components. So for the mobilization and reintegration of the FARC guerrilla, people like this in Colombia, but they have very mixed feelings about coexistence. Though it's very interesting that victims in Colombia, in stark contrast to what research tells us about other countries, appear to be more willing to forgive and coexist with former combatants. I'm sure Juana will delve more deeply into aspects of the demobilization, of the reintegration components of the accords and how that is doing. As far as political participation of former combatants go, this is extremely unpopular. And the fact that this is so unpopular is in no small part why the constitutional reform that was supposed to give extra seats in Congress to representatives of areas particularly hard hit by the conflict never passed. So when you have these really contentious proposals, when there is also not enough public support for them, it makes it even harder to make the push, as it indeed happened with the curules de víctimas, as they were known. What is called this Reforma Rural Integral, or the rural development component, this part in Colombia people really like, but it's also the part, to my knowledge, that has been less implemented and is more left behind. And probably Juanita or Mauricio can talk more in depth about this particular component of the accords. And to wrap it up, very quickly, I will say the following. So this leaves me the last one, the transitional justice component. Transitional justice is not only the Transitional Justice Tribunal in Colombia, but it is often conflated as if the accords were that, particularly because of the politicking, right? So transitional justice has become the most contested aspect. Those who strongly oppose it see the HEP, the Transitional Justice Tribunal, as benefiting the former guerrilla unity. And we have a government and a party in government that are opposed to the peace agreement, that don't really like them, and are playing electoral politics with the peace accords. So entire electoral campaigns have been run on the HIP as one of the key issues. But crucially, what I've seen in my research is that the HIP isn't in such bad footing among public opinion. And what we really need to see in the next couple of weeks is what happens when they hand down their first decision. And I will leave it there.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for that wonderful overview. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Juana Garcia Luque to tell us some more probably about reintegration.
Thank you, Gillian, for sharing the screen. And thank you, Alicia, Frances, and Steve, and Dr. Klaas for the invitation, and many thanks to those who make possible this Tuesday seminar. My presentation, and Alicia and Sandra mentioned, will focus in the point 3 of the agreement, end of the conflict, the last one that was negotiated, but the first that should have shown progress in the implementation. In my presentation, I will focus in some aspects of the economic and social reincorporation. You will see it is impossible to cover the whole spectrum. The content will cover 4 main aspects: what has been achieved along the process, the research project that we are doing in Universidad de los Andes and with other institutions and researchers, some challenge that implementation regarding reincorporation shows in the near future, and hopes and concern, and Alicia asked us to think about it. Gillian, next, please. What has been achieved? Let me just, from my perspective, the implementation of reincorporation process has made some advances, but they are not enough, as Sandra mentioned. I would like to mention some of the achievements: laying down arms. Also, the setting up of the transitional zones had inconvenience and delays. In the first phase of the agreement of the implementation, a milestone was achieved. In 9 months, the FARC laid down their arms, a process that was supervised by the United Nations. Reincorporation governance. The CNR, the National Reincorporation Council, created in the agreement, is the institution where FARC and Colombian government make decisions about reincorporation process. In addition, the government approved 2 policy documents: the National Council for Economic and Social Policy regarding reincorporation in 2018 and the Roadmap of Reincorporation in 2019. Both documents received input from the CNR. First, services associated with reincorporation. The areas formerly known as transitory zones became the ETCRs, or temporary spaces for training and reincorporation, and was created to hold the population of ex-combatants in the first step of the reincorporation process. In these spaces, they receive different first services from the Colombian government, as identifications, IDs, health, education, banking, and some training for productive projects. These zones today hold only 20% of the ex-combatant populations. Just to see some of the figures, sorry that they are in Spanish, but 13,000 ex-combatants are registered. More than 9,000 have left these training zones, and that represent 80% of the population. Regarding productive projects, more than 2,200 individual and more than 80 collective productive projects have been approved by the CNR, but they are not enough. Since approvals and formalizations have been slow in much cases, some of the ex-combatants have had to start their projects by funding them with their basic income or via support the international cooperation. Next, please. I will tell something about the project that we have been working from Uniandes University. We have and other institutions and researchers, we have the ambition to monitor the reincorporation of ex-combatants since 2017. The main project is in-person survey along the time. We want to do it for, I don't know for how many years, but hope to 10 or 20 years. That has 3 components: training ex-combatants on methods on data collection, focus group, and in-person large-scale panel with 4,000 ex-combatants. Along this preliminary project, we published a policy brief in 2020 and before the in-person survey, and because of COVID, we are working a remote survey for this first semester of 2021 with the following modules. We want to cover COVID-19, the impact and the challenges focusing gender, prospects regarding reincorporation process, economic, social, health, and safety, optimism toward the future, trust, interpersonal and institutions, because it's going to be a key component for reconciliation, and truth, reconciliation, and forgiveness. And we want to make emphasis in stigma and discrimination. Next, please. I will talk a little bit about the results in the policy brief. As I mentioned, we published last year this policy brief that we analyzed the attitudes of ex-FARC members toward the reincorporation process, taking the data from the National Reincorporation Registry that was collected in 2019 between the Colombian National Reincorporation Agency, ARN, and FARC. The registry was about to understand the situation of the population as well as to identify their needs. In the article, we study which characteristics of former members and their environment are associated with better behaviors and conditions for reincorporation. I will focus in only 3 findings, but the first one, future, the data reveals some good news. For example, almost 80% of former members are optimistic about the future, and 70% believe that the conditions of reconciliation exist, and more than 90% have a positive perception of themselves. Despite the positive perception about the future, the data also reveals the struggles that the ex-combatants manifest to have in order to handle new situations and adversities. More than 70% of them need to strengthen and to develop collective skills to overcome adverse situations and support the networks. And the last one about security and stigma. Regarding perceptions of security, the data raises some warning alerts. More than 44% consider that there is a personal risk just to be in the reincorporation process, and 70% say that they or their family had security problems. About the stigma, a disturbing result has to do with it, faced by the former members. In social or working environment, less than 7% feel discrimination, but in the other hand, 73% are careful to share that they belong to the FARC. This suggests that they perceive a stigma and that the lack of discrimination in everyday settings is maybe because they do not share their past or move in a limited and safer environments. Our conclusion, and there are more insights and more recommendations for public policy, but the big one is that it's important to incorporate different measures for success of the reincorporation process, since the single dimension analysis could potentially lead to an incomplete understanding. This falls from the fact that the correlations between the behaviors of former members are not always positively related. For example, those who most agree that have tools for reincorporation and even more optimistic about the future feel more insecure. Next, please. And regarding challenges, among the challenges, I would like to stress in a few of them. Security in terms of reincorporation, it is necessary to guarantee the security of ex-combatants. The data reveal that many former FARC members still feel that they or their families are at risk due to the participation of the reincorporation process. As of end of January 2021, there were 252 assassinations since the signing of the agreement, and the numbers continue in an increased pattern. Yesterday, I saw the new number, and is 6 assassinations additional. These represent a challenge in terms of public policy. The threats received by the population turns into unstable, not only the implementation and consolidation of the reincorporation, but also the whole agreement. Stigma, as I mentioned, 73% are careful to say that they were members of the FARC. This highlights the need to deepen the work with the civil population to prevent discrimination and stigmatization to former FARC members, even with people from the government. Abilities and education, the ex-combatants need to develop new abilities and need the education for that, but also need to recover abilities previously developed. The need to support and guarantee the sustainability of productive projects, because this is the future of economic reincorporation and also is the way to interact with other communities and other actors that will reflect also advances in reconciliation. Increasing the speed, increase the speed in decision-making and implementation that affects productive projects, but in general, the follow-up of the process. And I want to finish with the COVID-19, that the current pandemic has also put a new pressure of the population in reincorporation process, because many of the places where several former members of FARC are living, they lack the sanitary conditions to handle this emergency. And I want to finish with some thoughts, hopes, and concerns. I think the implementation of the agreement, I want to be optimistic. I think you can see a very transformative way of living in some regions, but not in the whole country. The security still is an issue. The government did not take control in regions, and other illegal groups did it. And I want to be optimistic, but we need a very high commitment from the government, and to realize that peace is not only government task. How can universities, private sector, other actors can help and add to this conversation, and also can add to the reincorporation process? And I think I will finish here, and I'm open for some comments and questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Juana. That was a great perspective on reintegration. So now I'm going to turn it over to Juanita Gobertus, who will give us the perspective from Congress.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Professors Hagopian and Levitsky. It's a pleasure to be part of this seminar. I've tried not to repeat what both Juana and Sandra have said, so some of the things I'll just go a bit faster to concentrate precisely on what Juana was saying at the end, which I think is the largest challenge that the peace process and peace implementation is facing now, which is the lack of a serious territorial security policy that can actually ensure security conditions for the implementation of the peace agreement to move forward. So a couple of ideas on achievements. Again, without repeating, I think a couple of things should be emphasized. One is that out of the 13,000 former combatants that demobilized, according to government data, 94% of them are actually members of the reintegration process. So even in spite of the fact that, yes, there is dissident movements, yes, there is violence in different areas of Colombia, it is not true, and it's usually held as true in Colombia, that the majority of the members of the FARC that demobilized have gone back into violence. That is just not the case. 94.1% of them remain in the peace process, in the reintegration process, in spite of all of the challenges that the peace process faces. Second also is that we actually had a pretty large ratio of weapons that were turned in by combatant in comparison to our other peace processes, the previous peace process with the paramilitary groups. So the ratio of weapons given per combatant was 0.58%. That compares, for example, with South Africa to a rate of 0.22 weapons per combatant. In this case, we actually were able to make sure that we had a ratio of 1 weapon per combatant, and this was viewed and oversight by the UN, which was, I think, a surprise to everyone, that actually a lot of new weapons were being turned in good conditions. Again, it would be impossible to say that every single weapon around the country was turned in, but it was a very important high rate of weapons per combatant. Also, an element that Sandra mentioned, but I think it's worth emphasizing, is that we had a very serious reduction of violence during the peace process. If you take the homicide rate between 2012 and 2016, there was a reduction of 28% in our homicide rate. Kidnapping, reduction of 70%. Attacks against infrastructure, 81%. So even, and I'll go into this, even in fact, in spite of the fact that the agreement was thought of not only as surrendering weapons, but as this idea of non-recurrence, and that we were to implement the other elements of the agreement, not just decommissioning and demobilization to ensure that this conflict would not recur. Just the fact of having a peace process, initiating talks, and then afterwards, of course, the ceasefire created a very important mechanism to reduce violence in the country. And of course, it's now obvious, but it's still pretty amazing to see it every day in Congress. I'm there, I'm sitting with 9 members, former FARC leaders and combatants, and they're sitting right next to former members or members of Centro Democrático Party who opposed the peace agreement. Many of them in that party and in other parties, themselves victims of the FARC. And we work together every single day. We discuss bills. Everyone talks about their own perspectives on this. And this seems pretty obvious, but it was not happening in 2012. And having that discussion democratically, even in spite of the challenges, I think it's a huge progress and a huge success of this peace agreement. What have been the setbacks? Well, of course, we've had lack of political will and lack of enough resources to be able to implement this agreement. And I'll just give you a couple of data. This comes from reports that we've been producing from the Peace Commission at the House of Representatives, and that we also co-author with members of the Senate that are doing oversight to the implementation of the peace agreement. Out of the 107 bills that were needed to implement from a legislative point of view the agreement, 38% of them are pending. In terms of the resources that are actually being injected into these territories most affected by the armed conflict, this is a process, according to the agreement, that should take 15 years to transform those territories that have been most affected by the armed conflict and by poverty in the country. And what we're seeing is that yearly, this government is investing 1.89% of what they should be investing to actually bring those territories to the average of Colombia, to the national average. In terms of access to land, and I'm sure Mauricio will go this into detail, so I won't say that much, but the agreement establishes a goal of distributing 3 million hectares of land in a period of 12 years to peasants that haven't had access to land. This government is advancing at a rate of 0.4% of the hectares that we should be distributing yearly to be able to actually meet that objective that was set in the agreement. In terms of reintegration, and Juana has gone into detail, but in spite of the efforts, in spite of the investment, up till today, this is data that is up till December 2020, 63.9% of the former combatants still don't have access to a productive project. So they've been having a monthly salary, they've been having access to different mechanisms to survive. That is true, even if, in spite of the huge security challenges that they face. But 63.9% of them still don't have access to a productive project, almost 4.5 years since the peace agreement was signed. So that does not give them a perspective of what could actually be of their life perspective and their life project. In terms of coca crops, and we can go into that in more detail, 99,000 families signed agreements to voluntarily eradicate. And this is a complex mechanism, but the whole idea was that if they eradicated, they could have access to a crop substitution program. Well, out of those families, 94.7% of them have not had access to a productive project to be able to embrace into licit activities and licit economies. Out of, again, Sandra already spoke a bit about the transitional justice mechanism. One leg of it is administrative redress. We've already registered more than 9 million victims in our registry. But at the rate that we're going in compensation, this is compensation that the state pays. It's a symbolic amount of money. If those victims were to take the Colombian state to trial, of course, the state would be convicted to pay much more. But at the rate the Colombian government is going so far, it would take us 57 years to be able to redress just compensate, not all of the comprehensive redress that is in our very comprehensive victims law, 57 years to be able to redress administratively all victims. So those are some of the setbacks. We're not going at the rate that we should. And of course, the fact that we're not having enough political will and enough resources is actually making those guarantees of non-recurrence non-existent. Therefore, we're very successful in demobilizing, doing the whole decommissioning process, but then in guaranteeing that those elements that were there present for violence to emerge for so many years are not being tackled at the rhythm that we should be tackling them to actually stabilize these regions. Why has it been so difficult? And this is where I want to go into the issue of security. We left intentionally out of the Havana peace agreement security sector reform. The decision of the former president was that, and I think he was right in doing so, was that we would not negotiate with the FARC the reform to our security system, but that we needed to do that process in Colombia. The reality of the matter is that neither in the Santos administration nor in the Duque administration, the members of the security sector have had the willingness to actually address these issues. The operational context changed. We're no longer fighting typical guerrillas. We are fighting different criminal gangs that penetrate civil society. We've been accustomed for decades to have the military be the ones that do control of rural areas. We do not have capacity to do rural police. We have very little capacity to administrate justice at a local level. To give you some of the data that we've collected out of those 170 municipalities that we called PEDET, those most affected by the armed conflict, 80% of them don't have criminal investigators. 35% of them do not have prosecutors to actually be able to fight the kind of crime that they're facing. There's very serious concerns, and I realize that my time is finalizing, but there's very serious concerns at the time of corruption at a local level in this kind of public servants in the military and the police. There's very serious concerns in terms of regulation of the use of force. These are the types of questions that the security sector should be asking and that they're not asking. So I would always be an optimist. I definitely think that this has been important for Colombia, even if we face very challenging moments. But I do think that we need to make sure that whoever comes to government in a year and a half now that we're going to election actually prioritizes the implementation of the peace agreement. This is the most important, even now, today, in the midst of a pandemic, even though everyone is now thinking about vaccines, the reality of the matter is that the main inequality in Colombia is the inequality between urban Colombia and rural Colombia. And the one thing that we cannot allow is that the next government continues to determine very little political will and very little resources to be able to overcome that inequality. If we do not do so, those territories will continue to destabilize. I leave on an optimistic note because I do think that the pendulum of power is shifting in Colombia. And I do think that there's a consensus, thanks to books like the recent book of Professor Levitsky on populism, that Colombia will be able to defeat populists, will be able to defeat those in the most polarized sectors of the right and the left, and that we will be able to have a new government that actually takes on the task of implementing seriously this peace agreement. Thank you for this space.
Thank you so much, for Juanita, and I'm glad you ended on an optimistic note. I was getting worried we'd have to invite you back in 57 years to analyze the implementation. So, and that's a great transition to hear more about the rural sector from Mauricio.
Thank you, Elisha. So yeah, it comes pretty handy with what Juanita was saying, and I think with Juana before and Sandra, that I think what I'm going to present really talks to a couple of issues that were not addressed. So I'd like to talk about one map, three stories that I think speaks to structural challenges in the peace implementation. I think most of the point that I want to make is that the United States is going to play a significant role, and I think the transition to the Biden administration should reflect some of these concerns. And then I'll talk a little bit about what I consider to be still, I think it's a hot piece. We're not at war, but things can be pretty fluid, and we might turn into, we might end into a third cycle. pretty much I recommend the book by Francisco Gutierrez. It's very nice meditation, very deep meditation on the risks we are facing right now. So here is a map of the Andean region, which really is the core of Colombia in terms of administrative power. I think that's why when you come to Bogota, you have such a hard time understanding where you are, because it seems like a relatively developed city, and bureaucracy is for the most part pretty competent. And so if you place a triangle on top of this map, then I think you can start seeing at least what I think are the three main stories of structural implementation. So the first aspect that I'd like to highlight is the Venezuelan crisis. I think currently we have a strategic deadlock in which we want to change the government in Venezuela. And I think Venezuela is increasingly interested in promoting military action and promoting the maintenance of these conflict situations. So some of the members of the FARC that went out of the process went to Venezuela. The ELN is known for having control in regions that have this shared this frontier with Venezuela. And really, I think from Bogota, it's very hard really still to grasp, how large this frontier is with Venezuela. So that's one story. I think the other one that is critical is the story of deforestation, climate change, coca cultivation, and what Juanita was saying, which is territorial peace really is not about individual families. It's about state building, closing the agrarian frontier, fighting against deforestation, and of course, stopping this idea of criminalizing the peasants that are cultivating coca in these territories. I think this is a story about coca and structural transformation. And then lastly, I think it's important, this other story, which I think, of course, it has to do with coca cultivation, but mostly it's about narco traffic. And I think this distinction between what is cultivating coca and narco traffic is key to redirect any policy that the United States might have in terms of narco traffic and illicit cultivation, which is to focus on narco traffic. And here, this is a story of massive amounts of cocaine going from the Pacific down the south into Maco and the area near to Cauca, and the areas up there close to Panama and the Tapón del Darién, so on and so forth. There is one bit of transition that I wanted to highlight here, an irregularity, which is this circle in the center, but it's explained mostly because there is a cordillera there, a mountain system that connects Venezuela with Urabá. So here is a map of how people voted for the plebiscito, the peace plebiscite, and where the no had more intensity in voting was in the Andean region, clearly. So there is like a story of two countries, really, an urbanized and a rural one. And then here is where coca is cultivated in Colombia. That's the zone of the Norte de Santander, Catatumbo. And then this is, the exclusion zone is mostly the Indian region. And the point that I wanted to make with the voting is that there is a strategic relationship between rural and urban areas, whereby you use the grievances of rural areas to get votes in the urban areas. And so Colombia is mostly urban. It's like 70% urban. So these 30% of the population that really suffers the consequences of the conflict, they matter in terms of the narratives that are implemented in urban areas about them. And so I think, and my claim is that neither the left or the right are really interested in solving the problems of these rural areas, but maintaining these grievances, these narratives are very important to get elected into office. This is the picture that we have from Human Rights Watch from January of social leaders killed in the last 2 years. And these are the municipalities that are prioritized for implementation of the PDET that Juanita was describing. Okay, so, and finally, here is a map of hot zone of deforestation. The red one at the bottom is the area where we are contributing much more to deforestation. Many papers linking coca, cattle ranching, and deforestation Here are the hotspots last year of Colombia's deforestation in the Amazon. I think rethinking the whole strategy in the South in terms of climate change and really building infrastructure in those communities, it's going to determine whether we enter into a third cycle or no. So a couple of points. I think at the external level, peace building in Colombia will strongly benefit from a negotiated solution to the Venezuelan crisis. As long as Venezuela remains in the state it is, I think we are going to face a threat of increased guerrilla activity. That's one factor, of course, is not the only one. We need to understand the coca economy in terms of climate change, and I think that's really a key message for me. Transformative state building is not just putting some security apparatus in those areas. People don't trust the army in those areas. We need a new way of thinking about those, many ideas on how to do that. And we need to end the war on drugs. That needs to happen. It's very unlikely, but I mean, to the extent that the United States can contribute to the end of the war in Colombia and many other hotspots of conflict in Latin America, it's because, I mean, we need to end the war on drugs. And then internally, I think we need to understand that this is a challenge in infrastructure, heavy investment in those areas, and a challenge of transforming the security apparatus there. So there is nothing like beautiful, small and beautiful is good. We can't rely on measures of the implementation of the peace agreement in terms of like workshops or small things like policy briefs or things like that. We need a transformation of the way we think about these rural areas in a way, in a sense, the way in which the Andean region relates to the rest of the country. I think it's a key point. I think I have a couple of minutes more. Elisha, do I have 2 minutes more?
You can take 2 more minutes, Mauricio.
Sure, thanks. So let's talk about this idea of the hot peace. I don't think we can ask of any peace agreement to end all conflict at once. And I reasonably thought in the first year or 2 years that having some conflict was part of a new way of like restarting a new Colombia in a sense. But I'm more concerned now, and I think there are many more reasons to believe that this hot peace can turn into an open conflict. So this is the trajectory of social leaders' killings per year. It's a linear progression. I think it's a serious concern. But this is the key. I mean, here is the point. When we think about Colombia as a whole, we see these trends and they might not be a matter of serious concerns, but I think the way in which the war has started in Colombia, these different cycles have started, is by contrasting, I mean, some hot spots in those areas that starts to like emanate, you know, it's like a map of a heating map. And so what I pay attention is to specific regions that are heating up at a very rapid like speed. So this is Cauca. That is the department that appears most often in news on these issues of violence and killings. And I would say that Cauca in the south, or Catatumbo near Venezuela in the north, and the region of La Zona, or the area of the Serranía de San Lucas and to the north of Antioquia are these kinds of hotspots that we should be paying attention to, and that they might end up emanating to the rest of the country. The last graph that I want to show is this one from Francisco's book, which shows the first cycle of La Violencia in Colombia, and then the second cycle. And what I think is most important of this graph is the short span of peace that, you know, it can be from 10 to 20 years, of course, but then if you don't do enough, then, you know, the rate of growth in violence can just spike. And so there is nothing that, you know, I know that the levels of violence today compared to 4 or 5 years ago are pretty low, but the rate of growth is really what is making me feeling some concern. So I'll leave there. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you, Mauricio, and thank you to the entire panel. Those were really fabulous presentations that covered a huge range of issues. So I'm going to try to pull some questions from the audience, and I'll give each of you a sort of targeted set of questions, but feel free, given there's so many transcendental themes, to touch on those for other panelists. So Sandra, there were some questions about the divides in public opinion. So first of all, do we see a generational divide in public opinion? And more broadly, what role are youth playing in the implementation of the Accord? So is there some generational hope in terms of implementation? And then Sandra, I also wanted to ask you, there's some confusion about sort of the rulings and what we should be looking out for in terms of the decision coming down from the HIP. So, you know, there was this announcement that the HIP is going to actually indict 8 members of the FARC at the end of January. But what should we actually be looking for in terms of the ruling? And more specifically, you know, what in terms of the ruling would actually legitimate the HIP in your opinion, and what might turn the public further against the HIP? My understanding was that the FARC members have the chance to accept some of the charges, and I'm wondering if that, from your perspective, would be a legitimating outcome or potentially further undermine the tribunal. So Juana, coming over to you. So you mentioned COVID as a complicating factor, but I also wanted to link your presentation to Mauricio's in terms of thinking about Venezuela and Venezuelan migration. Do you think Venezuelan migration has heightened the sense of labor competition or made it harder for the private sector or the public sector to generate reintegration options? I also know you work so heavily on the private sector that I'd love to hear more about what you had hoped for in terms of private sector participation and what's actually resulted. Is this really a failure of the government in terms of implementing these accords, or has the private sector also failed in some ways to do more to reintegrate combatants? And last, we have a question for you, Juana, as well, from June Ehrlich, who wants to know what your preliminary findings are in terms of gender and reintegration and whether you see any differences. Juanita, I know it seems far off, but given you ended on this optimistic note, I did want to ask you a little bit about what you hope for in terms of the 2022 presidential elections. Do you foresee the peace agreement being a major cleavage? Do you think there are candidates or parties that will be pushing for a fuller implementation and real investment in rural areas? And then also, I thought the issue of the reform of the security forces was a fascinating and really important issue. Maybe you can tell the audience, you know, could a security bill actually be generated in the legislature? Is there the possibility of a coalition pushing for those types of structural reforms? Or alternatively, do you see any presidential candidate or political party with incentives to really push a more structural reform to the security sector? Mauricio, given that you brought us some of the data on the killings of social leaders and civic leaders, I did want to hear a little more of your interpretation of what's actually driving these killings. Is this a consequence, for example, of Centro Democrático and the political polarization around the Accords? Do you really see these killings as stemming from structural factors like coca and the gaps left in terms of illicit economies? And also, you had a question of sort of the relationship between the resurgence of violence and infrastructure gaps. Do you actually think that, you know, more investment in infrastructure in these areas could have changed the security situation? And what type of infrastructure are we talking about? So as you talk about transformative state building, you know, you say we need to go beyond the security forces, but what else could the state really put in place that might change the security situation and obviously also promote a path of greater rural development? And just last question, obviously, you know, Santos and Duque to a certain extent has continued these major infrastructure bills, the 4G projects. Have those had any impact in terms of connecting rural and urban areas, or part of this kind of broader economic integration that is critical to resolving inequalities? So those are some questions to start. Take whatever you want out of them, and hopefully we will get through another round. So why don't we just go in the same order and start off with Sandra.
Okay, I've successfully unmuted myself. Thank you for the questions. I will try to be very brief to make sure others have time to speak as well. So first, regarding the divisions or what has been the role of youth and if there's any divisions among public opinion on this. So it's interesting because on the one hand, initially when the peace plebiscite happened, and there were a few days when there was this risk of what's going to happen with the agreement, will it be signed, blah, blah, blah. There were a lot of mobilizations, and I think young people were very crucial in those mobilizations. When I say youth, I mean people in their late teens and their 20s. There is no, this is not a movement like Peru, you know, where you see really like people in high school or stuff participating in the protests. So that's not necessarily the case here. So I would say at that moment, those mobilizations were pivotal. But I think that it's not, when you think about support for the agreement, if there's a generational gap, I think really, like, unfortunately, the gap that you have to look for to understand that is the Uribismo gap, right? So it's more to do with whether people connect and support Centro Democrático, and in particular, President Álvaro Uribe, that determines their how they perceive a lot of what happens on with the agreements. Though I should also say very briefly that one of the interesting things is that many of the younger people in Colombia don't have direct memories of the worst years of violence in the 90s, right? So they have an expectation of a different kind of life. And I think that plays into some of the characteristics in the terms of how they react to the violence that we are experiencing right now. Now going on to the HIP, let me summarize very succinctly. What can we expect? So a couple of days ago, like literally a week and a half, the HIP announced what was wrongly, or what has been wrongly dubbed as its first decision. And it was not really a decision. What happened at that point was that the HIP decided to officially press charges against the FARC commanders. So it's the first decision in the sense that in the way we use the word decision in Spanish, but they haven't formally handed down a ruling. So this was really important because the thing that you also need to have in mind about the HIP is that these are the macro cases, right? So because the HIP cannot, it's 50 years of conflict, so many victims, the HIP has decided that some things it will handle with big macro cases. And this is the first case, it's about kidnapping, and it involves the whole of the phenomenon of kidnapping as it relates to the FARC. So this is the first thing that we saw. And what we are expecting in the next couple of weeks is first, the response from the FARC commanders, and second, now formally the decision from the HIP. The problem, Alicia, is that the HIP is in an impossible position from, if you are asking me as a scholar who thinks about how people evaluate this, right? Is that they have to make incredibly unpopular decisions within a framework that refers to restorative justice, which is something that people don't really like, right? So if the HIP does its job, some people are going to be really mad no matter what happens, but doesn't mean that it's less important. So I would briefly say that what would legitimize this decision? So this decision needs to be legitimized by a lot of publicity, by a lot of work from the HIP, explaining what is going on. And crucially, what we know from peace processes elsewhere is that what helps a lot is when these things go together with a lot of truth recovery, with measures like reparations. So when it's not just a decision that stays on paper, but is part of a broader package of things. If you ask me, the HIP needs a very aggressive communication strategies the next couple of months.
Thank you, Sandra. So let's go to Juana next.
Okay, I will take the gender one and private sector, and the Venezuela migration. Maybe we will find some results, but not now. For gender, even Colombia had previous experiences of DDR. The previous one didn't have a percentage of women as the process with FARC. Process with FARC were with 23%, around 23% of women. And even in the negotiation, there were a gender table. In the reincorporation process, the call from FARC is that they need a gender perspective during the reincorporation process. What we are going to evaluate with the remote survey is exactly that, with the COVID and how COVID affect more the women that the men during the pandemic. I think what we have been seeing in our field work is that the women lost the equal role that they used to have in the war. Because they decide to have children, because they were they are making the reincorporation in rural areas where there's a high patriarchal society. But we will see with the next study what will happen, and especially with the COVID. And with the private sector participation is a key. As I'm mentioning in my hopes and optimistic way, we need to see the whole society that this is not only a task for the government. The private sector, the universities, the social society needs to have a special role. And the Chamber of Commerce of Bogota did a lot of service with the private sector and regarding the attitudes towards the peace agreement. And I think the main finding is that the private sector are very commitment with the peace. They see that they want peace, they want to build peace, but they don't know how to do it. And what we took some cases from private sector and the work with ex-combatants a couple years ago. And what we found is that the private sector is not only to hire and to pay more taxes for the peace building process, can be a different way of relationship with ex-combatants and other population. Also, we saw spaces for training, also reconciliation spaces made in the companies because of the ex-combatants met with some of the victims of the conflict. And just to see that private sector will have more than hire and more than taxes, and also is the possibility to create a different dynamics in some regions of Colombia.
Perfect. Thank you, Juana. Let's go to Anita now.
Thank you, Alicia. So I agree with Sandra on the generational divide question. Sadly, I wish it was different, but I sadly don't think that we have a generational consensus. I do think, however, that one of the unexpected effects of the agreement was that by September, November 2019, we experienced some of the largest national strike that we had ever seen. All of a sudden, youth, students, members of unions, but also people in their homes who were usually afraid to do any kind of social protest because that was associated to the left, it was associated with the guerrillas. All of a sudden they came out and said, we are tired of many things. We're tired of lack of employment. We're tired of lack of enough labor guarantees. We're tired of a government that is not implementing the peace agreement. Was one of the elements, not the one of the top of the discussions, but it was there in the manifestations, in the public protests. Also the protection, as Mauricio was saying, deforestation and the lack of enough resources and will to tackle deforestation in such a biodiverse country. So I do think that there was an awakening. I don't think there's a consensus, but there was an awakening, I think, and the different strikes that we've seen since 2019, I think, show that. As of 2022, it's very strange. I've been in politics very recently, But for me, it's really a very long campaign. We're used to having 8 months, 9 months of campaigns. It's almost like this is a 2-year campaign to 2022. I think it has to do with the fact that in general, both the center left and the center right have come to the conclusion that this government is just not going to do much better that it's doing very little in many senses, in spite of the fact that it's difficult, that governing is very difficult in general, that Colombia represents a huge challenge, and that facing a pandemic, of course, it's worse. But still, this is a government that doesn't have a lot of flavor. It doesn't even create huge unrest. It's just like a kind of government. So that lack of filling up the space, I think, accelerated the campaign. Everyone's just now thinking, let's have 2022 now. Let's just be over with this government. Even people on the right side of the political spectrum who are not necessarily happy with this government. So it really accelerated. That means that it's a long campaign. So far, what we've seen is that at least one of the lessons learned from 2018 has been learned, which is that we should not be divided, that we should be able to create coalitions. And so far, the left has been able to pull a coalition under Petro, but he's also, I think, learning his own mistakes of trying to collect a wider type of spectrum to be able to create lists for the Senate. Then there's us on the center left of the political spectrum. And in 2018, we went separated between Sergio Fajardo and Humberto de la Calle. And the difference in those votes would have taken Sergio Fajardo to the second round of the elections, as opposed to Petro doing so. And I do think that Sergio Fajardo would have been capable of defeating Duque, as opposed to Petro, because as Sandra was saying, there's this huge force in Colombia, which is Uribismo and anti-Uribismo. But there's also now this growing huge force, I think, of Petrismo and anti-Petrismo, which speaks of that polarization. So at least that lesson learned, I think, is being implemented. The right and the center right still haven't made public, at least, their coalition, but there's a lot of talk publicly about coalitions between traditional parties, the Liberal Party, the U Party, the Cambio Radical Party, which have historically engaged in a very clientelistic type of exchange between government and society, with the more extreme right of Centro Democrático and Uribe. And we might end up with these kind of 3 big coalitions that end up competing for 2022. And I do think that polls in Colombia have been showing that people are basically fed up with extremism and polarization. We'll see how that goes in an election. And finally, on a security bill, it's a very interesting question. First of all, I think the main incentive is that everyone needs to understand that the security situation in Colombia is worsening, and that this is a right-wing government that was elected under the premise of bringing security back, which they haven't done so, because security situation was much better when President Duque started. So it wasn't about recovering security, it was actually trying to make sure that things would go forward. And of course he didn't. He decided to run against the peace agreement. What we're seeing now, on top of the data that Mauricio was presenting on social leaders, is increase of homicide in rural areas, is 175% of increase of massacres between 2019 and 2020, 104% increase of landmine victims between these 2 years, and a 24% increase of forceful displacement in the country. So it is really a concern. And this is a right-wing government that is going to be much likely evaluated on the basis of what they did in terms of security. It's not going to look good. So I do think that the incentive will be to speak about security, not necessarily peace in terms of the peace agreement, but I do think that there will be an incentive to speak about security. Sadly, we still have a very weak Congress that does not have much knowledge or capacity to go into security issues. And sadly as well, we also have, I think, security forces that are very much into looking at themselves. I had the opportunity of working within the security sector for 3 years, several years ago, and they're not willing to have this conversation on reform when it comes from outside. It needs to come from within. So I don't think that there will be a capacity to push for a bill from the outside, but the next government will have to face, and there are very serious officials within the military and the police who are saying we need to tackle this situation, and this means changing, thinking out of the box. The way they're going, it's not going to work. So I think that's the kind of people that you need to work with. as a piece in the elections, I hope that Centro Democrático realizes that it's no longer as politically interesting for them to just speak about, as Sandra was saying, impunity and opposing the HIP, that it won't give them the amount of votes that it did in 2016 and 2018. And the reason is that we had territorial elections in 2019, and they did very poorly, Centro Democrático, because they insisted on that same rhetoric. And I think now with COVID-19, etc., people, of course, people feel, as Sandra was saying, that it's unfair that former combatants of the FARC are not going to jail, and that will most likely be in the air. But I do think that they at least 2019 showed that was no longer as persuasive an argument, given the needs of people that are having other priorities. So I hope that at least on that side, it doesn't become the center of the discussion. And I certainly think that people are much more concerned now about unemployment, of the increase in poverty, for example. And I think, or security, of course. I think that the campaign most likely will have to deal with those issues.
Fascinating, Juanita. All right, let's go to Mauricio for a response.
Thank you, Elijah. I mean, I think I can talk about two things, about the social leaders. I mean, let's think what happens when a social leader is killed in Colombia. I think violence is never, I don't think it's very useful to distinguish like political violence from politics in general. And so when a social leader is killed in Colombia, it has an interpretation that somebody from the left has been killed. And so that means a specific sector of the opinion and a specific set of politicians are going to mobilize and are going to express outrage in Twitter and so on and so forth. When a rancher is kidnapped, on the other hand, then the right is going to be mobilized. And so the sort of like political mobilization in terms of victims is extremely polarized in the country. And so there are some, it's like you have, you know, blind spots. And so depending on which political side you are, there are things that just hurt you worse. And I think the problem is that I don't think the conflict today is at a point where everybody's affected equally. And so I think the people that are paying the price at this stage are coming from the left. And I think that's one thing that I'd like to point out. Now, you're killing Colombia, being a social leader, it has to do with these territorial dynamics that I was pointing out. It's not the same reason why you're killing Tumaco in the south that you're killed next to the frontier in Venezuela. I won't go into these details, but I think there are three main reasons why people are being killed today. One is for believing in the agreement. That I think is, you know, I did believe in the agreement, but today, if I would be in a rural area, I'd say like, you're risking your life for believing in this. In urban areas, we don't expect much to happen in the following years. Why are you insisting in believing, for example, in this replacement of your illicit crops and calling for meetings, saying that you're buying this narrative of the agreement? In this new order, in this local order, you're seen as betraying the orders by this new warlord that is in the region. So believing in the agreement has turned into a deadly decision in many rural areas. And so that's one of the key issues. Coca cultivation and replacement is one, and the other one is land restitution, right? Like you're asking the state to reinstitute your land that was stolen from you, and then as a leader, you can be killed in some of these regions because you're going against the powers that be at the local level. Then you might be killed as well because some of these hotspots are in your, you know, hotspots of the war are in your way. Like in Cauca, a lot of people, like indigenous communities, are in the middle of these corridors that are being disputed by different armed actors. Indigenous communities are trying to defend their autonomy. They have captured some of these people, and the price they are paying is a retaliation in terms of like massive killing of their members. And so that's the second reason, I think. And finally, I think is because you are participating you want to have political participation on the left. And in rural areas, we just had a genocide of people from the UP that are, you know, big party, relatively important party in rural areas from the left. And it is a case in the Inter-American Court of Justice of Human Rights. And so far, there is nothing really significant that has been done in terms of like understanding what just happened with the UP. So I think this is a process that is not over, and this is another reason you might be killed. Now, how does it matter in terms of like information in Bogota? Well, it depends. It depends on Twitter, who you are following, which political party are you tuned to. And so in that sense, I think there is no much of a consequence, I think, at the deeper level to the people that already believe in the right and they're already voting for the right. They don't listen to that to the level that people on the left are listening to. And that brings me to the second point, which is what is the implication for 2022? Well, I think that the main problem is that the conflict is created in itself, this polarization between these massive groups of resentment, for or against the agreement. And so the big challenge for the Green Party is to produce a narrative that really creates an identity in terms of moving forward with a new country. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge, particularly because the Greens and this coalition is, imagine the Democratic Party without the Democratic parties. Like you have all these constituencies separated and they have to come to fight against Trump. They don't have an institution called the Democratic Party. So you can already see how difficult it would be to put together Biden and Bernie Sanders in a couple of months. Okay, so that's part of what we are seeing today in terms of this coalition for peace, opposing these extremes. Now, in terms of the structural problems that we have in rural areas, I mean, really, you had this experience in the 19th century in the United States, whereby you would send settlers to places where the indigenous communities were, and you would promote, the settlement, you would promote the violent extinction of your indigenous communities there, and then you would grant free land rights to some of these occupations of land. The country really, the United States recognized that it didn't have the capacity to go and regulate all these land titling, but it had to go and see what was the de facto situation and offer some form of titling, because in the absence of titling, you couldn't have an administrative capacity at the municipal level. You couldn't have a sense of what's yours and what's mine. And so it was the way in which the United States set up its occupation of the territory. It was nasty, it was ugly, but in the end, it was part of what needed to be done. Legalizing land rights in Colombia has been a massive challenge because the conflict has produced incentives to accumulate land and take it from people that don't have these land titles. So you should start from there, and then from that you build the capacity for municipalities, for taxes, and so on and so forth. The idea today is that you start by sending a battalion of people, of the army. So you start occupying the territory with battalions. That's not going to work. And so the point is, you start with land rights, you think about climate change in context of land rights, and from there you build bottom up. I think that's the way to go.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mauricio, and thank you to the entire panel. This really was such a rich discussion. I should echo one of the comments in the chat came from Rob Carl, who's one of the best historians in Colombian politics, saying this was the best doctored class panel on Colombia he's been to, and I certainly feel the same. So thank you to all of you for illuminating what's an incredibly contentious and challenging process. I just want to wrap up announcing that we're going to be picking up on some of these themes of deforestation and energy politics next week here at Dr. Class. So Catherine Hochshelter, who's a professor at LSE, is going to be speaking about her new book, Latin America's Energy Transition, Wind and Solar Power in Brazil. So please join us here next week. And apologies to those of you who asked questions that we didn't get to, but thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to the panelists for a really fabulous discussion.
Thanks to you.
Thanks, everyone.